and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramroop, and I'm very pleased to say my guest today is an old friend of the program and also an old friend, Dr. Stephen Ramroop, CEO of the ODPM. Welcome back.
Nice to be back.
And today we're starting off a series of chats with you and other types of programming to outline what the ODPM is all about and about our national response framework, among other things.
Yeah.
So we'll kick it off today, but let's start by talking about a recent development, which was the prison break, which saw Chinese, as we tend to do, flying into a panic and trying to flee the capital city based on a small incident that happened in the isolated area, basically. That kind of outlines why we need to have proper planning for events such like that, doesn't it?
Yes.
Perhaps you can tell us how the ODPM fits into that scenario.
The ODPM has actually evolved into what is called a civil protection agency, civil defense, public safety. In many countries of the world, you have a Ministry of Civil Defense or a Department of Civil Defense or Department of Public Safety. In the United States, it's called FEMA. So what had happened, it started by, in Trinidad and Tobago, if you can remember, we had what is called NERO, which was the National Emergency Response Organization, followed by NEMA, which was the National Emergency Management Agency. And then this changed the Office of the Disaster Preparedness and Management in 2005. All of this started to change with even the Caribbean, CARICOM countries. They formed what was called CIDERA, which was the Caribbean Emergency Disaster Response Agency. And then CIDERA was transformed into CIDEMA around 2004, which was the Caribbean Emergency Disaster Management Agency. So what you saw was a transition from a purely response-centric type entity to what we have now as more the management of disaster risk reduction. Now note the years. In 2005, the government of Trinidad and Tobago changed the whole operations of the National Disaster Office from NEMA to ODPM. And this was in response to a global responsibility for all nations under the UN system. In that in 2004, we all witnessed the disaster, the natural hazard that turned into a severe disaster of the tsunami in the Pacific, which affected thousands of people lost their life. And one of the most important things that you would realize at that time, it was the first time as human beings we actually witnessed a disaster on the television. We saw people die just around Christmas of that year. And that was a tremendous, tremendous loss of livelihoods, loss of people, loss of heritage, loss of culture. So that caused a significant interest throughout the globe as to what are we doing for disasters, how are we managing disasters.
Why that 9/11 didn't create a similar...
What had happened, it had started the discussion at that time. But when the world, you see, this happened in America. This here was actually, although we saw it was happening in America, this was a global, where thousands of people, I mean, we're talking about thousands of people lost their lives.
In a natural disaster,
That's
as opposed to 9/11.
We talked about nearly 240 to 300,000 people losing their lives. And I think this is something compared to 2000 in terms of loss of lives. People realize that we need to decrease the loss of life due to disasters. And that is one of the primary aims. And in Hyogo in Japan, in 2005, the United Nations formed and developed a strategy, which was the Hyogo Framework of Action. The United Nations department that we all the member countries is the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction. Just like you have UN OCHA, UNDP, UNICEF, all of these organizations for disaster risk reduction, the entity in the UN system that coordinates and integrates and collaborates with all member states is the UNISDR. They set the global strategy. And in 2005, the Hyogo Framework of Action was developed. And incidentally, before that, in 2004, as I intimated, CARICOM countries had already realized that there was a need to change our focus from just being a response-centric entity. So when a disaster occurs, then you have the disaster office trying to do things. So you changed that and you became more of a management agency that managed disaster risks. I think this is what the ODPM is now. It has transformed, it has evolved into a risk reduction agency that identifies, quantifies, assesses, works with, educates, empowers, and all entities to understand their risks, all persons in villages, communities, private sector, in the business sector, in government, sectors of government, ministries, authorities, every single soul in the country must understand their risks, where they are, where they work, where they play, where they recreate, where they procreate. All of this is very important. So people must understand their risks. And I think this is what we are talking about. You talked about, for example, an incident in Port of Spain. We had numerous incidents in Port of Spain where they were panicked. For example, you had where people were said, leave the city, there's a storm coming. You had another thing where you have flooding and people got into panic. You had a coup d'etat in 1990. So there are a number of instances before this incident recently where people were in panic. Now, this basically is what the ODPM is bringing to the table. Because we are beginning, and remember I say beginning, because even though we were formed in 2005, the challenge has always been, what is the ODPM? Is it a flood agency? I have some colleagues, for example, I'm a surgeon, and they say, every time they see me, oh, there's no flood, so you don't have to worry. So ODPM becomes or was thought of to be just a flood agency. Something happens in the country, call the ODPM. If there's a flood, it's ODPM. In fact, there's still a problem in the country where in certain instances, just recently, there was one person who actually accused the ODPM or one member of the ODPM of being very distasteful and very rude to that person. And that was not even an ODPM person, because ODPM people don't go on the ground with anybody. We manage, we coordinate, we collaborate, we work with the agencies that are supposed to be doing what they should be and trying to build a capacity to do that.
I think it's important that we emphasize that part,
Yes.
because people are very quick to point at the ODPM and
Yes.
blame you guys,
Yeah.
even though you're not really an executive agency, are
Yes.
you?
Yes.
As you mentioned, you're a management
That's
agency. You
correct.
bring together all the components
That's correct.
and ensure that they work.
And it's what we say. So in the beginning, when I did start in 2011, and we were looking at, we did a study, right? We did a national survey to gauge how people were looking at the National Disaster Office, and not just the National Disaster Office, what the National Disaster Office was supposed to be doing. And clearly it actually supported what I previously said. We had a nation that was essentially a bit, what we should say, they didn't understand their risks, so that there was an element of complacency. Out of this study also showed that we had a bit of dependency, in that people were beginning to depend on the government for everything. So these are very significant elements that decrease the resiliency of a society, in that societies that are actually able to survive impacts based on the science of disaster risk management or reduction shows that societies that are able to pull together, understand things like empathy and loss, are able to save the heritage sites, understand the culture, have mitigation practices in terms of putting away their disaster bags and knowing where their shelters are, they are more resilient. And for 72 hours, most of the countries, no matter how developed they are, we have to train people to understand that disaster authorities cannot come to you under that time. That is a sort of benchmark time that you must make sure that people become resilient and understand the risks that they are facing in that time. So that has been the challenge of ODPM. We knew we knew before. I mean, before we were told that the storms were coming and people were still drinking down and, at certain pubs in the west of the city. So therefore, we know that we had that element of complacency, because we in Trinidad we have not experienced that extent of impact like Jamaica or Grenada or even Tobago. So therefore, even Tobagonians are much more resilient than Trinidad when it comes to that, because it etched in their history. They have had impacts that have destroyed more homes and property and livelihoods than Trinidad, compared to some of the when we compare Trinidad and Tobago as two different islands. So even then we have a little difference. And coming out of that, NEMA, which is the Tobago Emergency Management Agency, coming under the Tobago House of Assembly, is probably more equipped and resourced because of the smaller island, because of better legislation, to actually have a greater value added, as it were, in terms of trying to be prepared and ready for emergencies that might assist them. Whereas the ODPM now has been fighting as a central government agency to now begin to pull all the different sectors, not just of the public sector, all the different ministries, authorities, agencies of the public sector, but also now, which is the evidence coming out from the science, we have to engage the private sector and the business sector. The biggest, according to the global assessment
And NGOs,
report,
of course, as well. Yeah.
that is the third part. The first one is the public sector, second is the private and business, and the third is civil society. Civil society, according to the Hyogo framework of action, we had to what we call engage the institutions There's no sense going in and doing the work that has already been done in the communities. There are a lot of non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, sporting groups, things, people like institutions like Red Cross, Trinidad and Tobago Red Cross Society. They have been within the communities. There are a number of church organizations, religious organizations that have actually evolved in a lot of the communities. So you don't go and reinvent the wheel. You try now to build the capacity of those institutions. And then a lot of these institutions, as we said before, they were response-centric. You bring a big warehouse, you pack it up with clothing and foods and hampers and pampers, and a lot of your efforts were concerned and actually channeled into having resources for when a disaster occurred. Whereas the teaching, the evidence is saying we need to still have that, but we need to refocus and begin the preparation and the mitigation and the planning and the development of an understanding and education of what your risks are. What do you do when an earthquake happens right now in this building? Do you run out of the building, or do you sit under this table and await the first tremor, second tremor, and then you evacuate? Now these are different. If there's a fire and explosion, what do you do? Go under the table, or do you run out? Now these things you have to educate the public. People need to know the difference in how they maneuver the impacts due to the hazards. So this is what the ODPM is now. Is that how do you engage, for example, the space that you are in? The ODPM is currently under the Ministry of National Security. We are a national security entity. In other words, then we share common practices and relationships with the police service, with the fire service, with the intelligence network, with OLEP, with immigration, so that and previously we had a relationship very closely with the national security with, as you know, the prisons. We work very closely with customs and excise, although they are in the Ministry of Finance, because these are the national security entities that are responsible 24/7 for protecting not just our homeland security issues, but our borders, because under that comes the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force with the air, land, and sea resources. So therefore, if you look at that network, ODPM actually is fitting into that. And then over the last 2 years, it was really a blessing to now begin to introduce what is called the National Operations Center. The National Operations Center is not a building. The National Operations Center is a system, right, that now incorporates civil defense, intelligence, hard security issues such as border and homeland security. So that intelligence, hard security, both border and homeland security, and civil defense and civil protection all comes under the National Operations Center system.
So it's a series of linkages.
That's correct.
Whereas before they operated separately.
That's correct. It fuses the activity in the golden hour, as it were. Because as you can well imagine, even in medicine, right, if somebody gets injured on a highway or in a home, or they have a heart attack in a home, or there's an explosion, there's a time period where if you can maneuver the airway, their breathing and their circulation, their cervical spine and their disability, and you make sure they can actually save that life. Because if you lose that opportunity to get that air into the lungs and feed the brain in that time, no matter what you do, the people will die. Mm-hmm. So you can have the best system in the world, you can have the best hospital, you can have the best doctors, but if somebody gets in an accident on the highway and you cannot secure the airway in that little time when they're most vulnerable, then there's all those resources you have in the hospital is a waste of time. So the same can be said for managing emergencies and disasters. There is a golden hour when we are asleep, when all the civilians are vulnerable. The persons who are out there, the persons who are paid to be there for 24/7, all night long, all day long, are our first responding agencies, or first responders by law. And they are the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service and Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. There's nobody else except the ambulance service. So the three most important first responders, or the first responders, nobody else are first responders in Trinidad and Tobago and in most parts of the world. Fire services, police services, and ambulance services, they are our first responders, not even the military. The military is actually positioned there so that when further resources are required or discretion allows them, they can act. I mean, obviously, if you have a military battalion which is stationed and there's a bridge falling down, there's cars, and you wouldn't expect them to be not first responders. But because of their resources, they can act and save lives. Militaries play a very important role in search and rescue. And in that hour, in that first day, when people are under the rubble or their survival capabilities are very, very limited, this is when you depend on your first responding agencies and your fire services and your police and your military to do search and rescue. Then you can have specialized people coming in after. Because after that, when power goes, then you will need the T and techs. When your phones go, then you will need the TSTTs and the Digicells, etc. When your water is disconnected because of the water that is disrupted in the earthquake and you have no water, this is when you will need the trucks and the dams to supply water. So they come in, they are your second line of responding agencies. Very important in managing any disaster, whether it be a plane crash, whether it be a massive earthquake, whether it be a hurricane, whether it be a coup d'etat, whatever the hazard that is posing a threat to the citizens and residents of the country, the action that follows is very similar. The actions are very similar, as stated.
And of course, you require tools to do the jobs that you're doing.
Yes.
One of the interesting subjects that's been coming up in this program a lot quite recently is the spatial survey of Trinidad and Tobago.
Right.
To me, one of the key uses of that information, and apparently it's well advanced,
yes,
would be for the ODPM to plan.
Yes, and
see vulnerabilities.
Definitely, because it's like when we did geography at O level or advanced level, you were presented with a map. Many of us, when we were doing the mapping part of geography, we used to take a little page and measure the distance between two towns and use a little string,
Rather
if you remember.
If I recall.
Yes,
yes.
but now you have, technology has evolved that you can take your finger on a phone and zoom into a map right down to the street, and the car, and the number plate on the car. So technology has allowed us now to look at our situation, not just extraterrestrial in terms of having satellite systems to help the agencies like the ODPM to look at threats that we may not have the land-based systems to support. But also we have very good GIS, geographical information systems network in Trinidad and Tobago. That has allowed...
And you can spot vulnerabilities with that, can't you?
And that is the purpose of mapping. So, for example, let us take, the Ministry of Planning and Sustainable Development with UV Seismic, University of the West Indies Seismic Department, and a committee that has been set up by the government of Trinidad and Tobago to do what we call microzonation. What is microzonation? Microzonation really is that you can think of having an understanding of Port of Spain, and you can think of taking a magnifying glass now and going straight into the streets, right down into the actual buildings and infrastructure, the critical infrastructure that might be affected. What microzonation will tell you now, well, hey, this building can sink, that building can fall, that building is an area that is stable, this is where we should now evacuate instead of what we thought. Instead of saying going to the south of the city, then we might have to say, oh, well then we might have to go to the southeast of the city instead of just southwest of the city.
Because you can spot blockages in advance,
absolutely,
knowing the vulnerabilities of certain buildings.
So you have a more detailed understanding of the mapping. Now, when you talked about the plans that we talk about, remember we said we are not just responding now. Now we are sitting down and saying, listen, you have a 3-story or a 10-story building. What we want to do is, we want to come to you and tell you there's a chair, for example, that is now excellently and technically developed, where you can put a person with a disability on the chair and wheel them down a step without having to lift them. That chair doesn't cost very much in the whole scheme of things. And when your insurance kicks in, if somebody does die in your building, that's much bigger than an investment in a chair. So that if you have elevators, you cannot use an elevator if you're evacuating, as you well know, for fire. So investment in a chair is very important for all those employers who have persons in a multi-story building, or not just employees, but visitors who might have disabled or disabilities.
Or in fact even be injured during the event.
And that is correct. Right. So therefore now you're looking at why are we getting involved in that? Well, that is very simple, because we have learned that in emergencies or disasters, that over 50% of the persons who are killed are persons with disabilities.
Over 50%?
And over 50% of the persons who are killed have some degree of disability. In other words, in the person with the stroke in the village, the lady who has just delivered a baby and is on bed, had a cesarean section and came home that evening, those are the persons who will be left behind in a process. And this is something that we must understand. So if the data are showing us that the vulnerable persons are the ones who are going to die first, then a lot of ODPM's focus is to strengthen the capacity of agencies, institutions, entities, authorities, ministries, divisions, homes, businesses, private sector, all those persons who are dealing with persons with vulnerability. Not just disability. The evidence has shown that females, young children, old persons, they also come under this category. So that now you have to look at gender issues. And when you look at gender issues, that brings in a broader picture of understanding. Then there's another element that we have to look at. We have to look at our heritage sites. You have to look at our churches, or temples, or mosques, or places of recreation, or cultural places. And this is very important because if we lose 300,000 persons in a massive earthquake from 1.3 million, the actual balance of people who are there, our nationals, will have to rebuild a country, rebuild our culture, rebuild our religious institutions, rebuild our society, and heritage sites are extremely important in having them preserved. It preserves a people. So now you say, before we were just responding, before we were just getting the police and the fire and people to do their work, and now we're getting involved in heritage, in trying to get the people who are responsible for preserving our heritage sites to do their work.
Well, I knew you had a big job before, but, and it's actually getting bigger and bigger the more I listen. Because I didn't really think that gender issues and culture are also key to how you respond.
Yes.
We have about 5 minutes left, and we will continue this conversation another day.
Yeah.
I have to ask you, there's another example that's happening right now. I understand there's a possible hurricane forming off the coast of Africa, heading in the direction of the Caribbean.
It's just east of Barbados.
In terms of forward planning, how does the ODPM handle something like that?
Well, the first thing is to know that it was there in the first place. And I think that is something very key to the planning of any emergency, knowing that it is there. And that's why it's very important to have the NOC system now. Well, we knew about it because the ODPM existed long before the NOC. So our knowledge of that actual disturbance started since about this morning, when we were informed by our persons that in contact with the regional meteorological services that they have identified a disturbance, and it has all the features of developing into something very naughty. What we have done really is we are going to be watching it, because this actual disturbance might have a tendency to veer a little westerly and southerly. So at this point in time, it could do anything. Basically, as I said, you have to be careful that you don't scare or panic. Because the thing is, as I indicated in my previous discussion, we plan for all emergencies. So this is just one of the hazards that could pose a threat. It is not a threat as yet, and that is the definition, the difference between a hazard and a threat, right? A threat only becomes a disaster when it impacts people, livelihoods, environment, and of course, you know, our society and our heritage. So when that happens, it becomes a disaster when people are affected. If it is just in the ocean and it goes north and it does anything to anyone, that threat does not become a disaster. It's still a hazard, but it poses no threat.
So therefore, the ODPM is keeping an eye on it.
That is correct.
But you're not going into
full
mode yet.
That's correct. And then in going into mode, then we have developed, the government, of course, have approved the national alert state. You know, based on that, you elevate your levels of threat, so that if we say that the hurricane has a 60% probability of coming towards Trinidad, then now we raise our level of threat, or threat level, and then we begin to now mobilize our first responding agencies, our second line of responders, and then when we have them ready and they say, okay, we have resources in place, we're all there, in a very timely manner. We keep the population tuned, but we don't give them all the information. And then at a certain time, when we know that our first responding agencies, our second line of responders, our key institutions, our schools, our school principals, etc., our corporations, our people in the rig, there's a certain number of persons who you must now have a group of, so that you can alert them and say, okay, this is now, we have raised our threat level from, well, whether you use a color system or whatever system. It's just a matter of raising that alert. When you raise that alert, there are certain standard operating procedures that are executed. Some people are very well organized. They have it in a book. They send a book to all the key managers and say, okay, we now go to stage 2, which has what you have to do for your workers, what you have to do for your rigs, what you have to do for your vehicles, what you have to do for your health systems. And they go through it and they say, okay, A, B, C, D, you have to do this. You have a radio, check your radios, fix your radio. This is definitely operating in a lot of our corporations, in a lot of our multinational corporations. They're very highly evolved in terms of their systems, in terms of the emergency systems. The people who we have to work on are of course, will be our villages, our communities, our church groups, our religious organizations, our people in the villages and the community. They are our most vulnerable, especially ones who are in squatting settlements next to rivers, fisher folk, people on the rigs. So we now have to identify our vulnerable people. As we said before, disabled persons, persons who are living alone, single parents, children, old persons, infirm persons, people who are definitely vulnerable. We identify them. We have a map with all the old people home, with all the disabled homes, with all the children. We have that in ODPM. We know where they are. We know the GPS coordinates, and this is where things like the services like from the military will come in. If we know that the impact is going to be in a certain area, we can actually use models, right? Although they're crude, we can use models to predict the number of population that's going to be affected, the number of vulnerable persons in there, and this has been improving over the period of time.
So the ODPM has been laying down the groundwork and the framework that you can, but if the worst does happen, we've got things in place.
At least it's better than how it was.
Well, we're completely out of time, but we'll continue this conversation another day. Dr. Ramroop, always a great pleasure having you in the program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here.
Right.
Thank you. You've been watching One on One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.